Well, thank you very much, and especially I thank the organizers of this event for inviting me to comment on this paper. I have to say that over the years, I think they have often given me the most interesting and challenging papers, for which I appreciate, and I think that this Evans paper here certainly qualifies for that. The paper is extremely ambitious to try to give us a comprehensive understanding of what the Equal Protection Clause did and did not do in a relatively short space is quite impressive. This was actually something that, as recently as say 20 years ago, was greatly neglected. Very few people spoke in terms of the differences between the three parts of Section 1, not to mention the Citizenship Clause. Most of the major historical works paid little attention to language or to the ways in which the particular clauses of the 14th Amendment were put together. So this is was once a neglected field, no longer actually. So I have to mention, so Chris Green and Ilan Warman, two of the folks who are here with us today, have done great work on this as well. But Evan has made a major contribution to the point that I, with his permission, am assigning Section 3 of this paper to my class on Reconstruction for a week after next. And that's a very high compliment, Evan. One of the things that I like about the paper is that it puts together the long historical context of the legal concepts, especially of protection, and to put that together with the legislative history of the 14th Amendment to and all too often, I think originalists tend to go in one direction or the other, but don't see the way in which those things fit together. I want to make some comments on methodology and then on substance. Methodology, I recommend that people pay attention to what Evan does, not to what he says. You might think from the beginning of Section 3 that we're getting, a more just sort of original public meaning, Larry Solomon style, a word. He actually refers to this as having to do a word game. But that isn't actually what he does. Actually, methodologically, this is refreshingly old-fashioned as a form of originalism. Why do I say that? So first of all, it's in the history camp. He's not interested in idealized, abstract people, but about what real flesh and blood people at the time meant by what they did. That's at least in Section 3. He doesn't project his own normative judgments onto the framers and ratifiers. In fact, in some important ways, he rejects views that he would like normatively. He doesn't obsess about dictionaries and unrelated word usage. He actually looks at these things in their political context according to what people were trying to accomplish with the language. And perhaps most startlingly, he uses legislative history. Now, when I do that from time to time, people often tell me that I'm behind the times, so I'd like to welcome Evan to the Behind the Times club. He even argues from predominant views, so he pays attention to how many people take particular positions, something we talked about a little bit yesterday in connection with Dick Fallon's paper, but I think is generally rejected by most modern originalists. But maybe this will be a turn in the tide, because obviously that does matter. And he recognizes that the weight of an opinion depends in part on its political context. Thus, when strong supporters of the right to vote emphatically denied that the amendment covered the right to vote, that's powerful evidence. But when opponents in the amendment suggest far-fetched applications, those have to be taken with a grain of salt. All of that, I think, is good sense, and I'm glad to see it here. and it interprets the essay interprets the views of the senators and representatives in light of their overall positions rather than yanking particular phrases out of context. So, from time to time, he'll identify a particular quote that seems to be taking a more extreme or unqualified position, but he will rein us back in by reminding us that that speaker could not mean the full extent of that because of some other position that they are taking. The paper also relies on post-ratification history. Yay, the major source of understanding of what people meant, but often criticized. And then finally, I don't really know whether to give this a cheer or not, but a whole section 4 of the paper, seems to be about original intent. Interesting to see that. And so section 3 is really the originalist part of this paper, and it is serious. It's fairly comprehensive. There might be a half a dozen or so places where I would quibble with particular interpretations of particular points, but I'm not even going to get into that because it's all a matter of detail. It's a very a serious rendition, and the main point of it is to reject two positions. One is the generalized anti-discrimination idea, and the other being the anti-subordination interpretation. One of those is current doctrine. The other is orthodoxy among major swaths of the academy. And Evan shows that neither of those positions is consistent with the evidence of the original understanding. But then at the end of section 3, the essay seems to go off the rails. It begins even before section 4 by telling us about the Supreme Court in DeShaney, and says what the history surveyed here is to the contrary of the Supreme Court's holding in DeShaney. No, it isn't. Not a scrap of the evidence that Evan talks about is inconsistent with DeShaney. The Equal Protection Clause is not about universal protection. The state may very well owe people protection, including Randy DeShaney, right? But the federal Constitution only superintends the state's execution of that obligation when it comes to unequal protection. It requires equal protection. So I do think that some of Justice Rehnquist's language in DeShaney is exaggerated and rather foolish. It isn't true that that there's a state action doctrine in quite the sense that he may imply. State inaction is certainly, and I agree with Evan on this, but I think everyone who's looked at the matter really agrees with Evan on this, that state inaction is what the Equal Protection Clause is about. No state may deny to any person the equal protection of the law. That certainly is about state inaction, but the state inaction has to be unequal, right? And so what does unequal mean? As best we can make it from the sources that Evan talks about in his paper, unequal means that a group or caste or class is being denied the degree of protection that they would get if that members of the dominant class are given. And so you have that's the inequality that's involved. Well, Joshua DeShaney, by the way, didn't mean Randy, that's the bad guy. Joshua DeShaney was not given inadequate protection because of his membership in any kind of a group or class. It was just that the government doesn't do a very good job of enforcing the law. And that is not a violation either of due process or of equal protection. In fact, as Rehnquist tells us in a footnote, that the plaintiffs didn't even bother to allege any kind of inequality. So that's why equal protection simply doesn't apply. But then we get into part 4, where we talk about the spirit of the Equal Protection Clause. Well, I'm a little nervous about this word spirit. When you get to the spirit, I begin to wonder, what are we really talking about? Are we still talking about the meaning of the 14th Amendment at all? And Evan then tells us, he begins this section by saying, we have seen, which I take it to mean that the evidence that he has already presented supports these things. And then he says that Republicans describe the clause as a means of. Republicans, what does he mean by that? Some Republicans, one or more Republicans, most Republicans? Does he mean that this is the dominant view? What exactly does he mean? Is he throwing out every view that that has any support whatsoever? I just have no idea what he means by this. But the first, protecting formerly enslaved people against Ku Klux Klan violence, certainly true. Second, guaranteeing particular protective services and procedural rights, true, but everything, all the meaning is packed into the word particular, which isn't defined for us. And I can tell you what the particular means, according to the evidence, and that means what is being provided to the dominant group. So this is an equality right. There is no guarantee of services and procedural rights in the abstract. What's being guaranteed is an equality in services and procedural rights that have to do with the protection of life, liberty, and property. The third, protecting people against subjugation of their life, liberty, and property, whether by state or non-state actors. Well, here I really get nervous. The word subjugation doesn't seem to appear either in the sources or even in the paper. I mean, I did a Control F to try to find, there is a little definition of subjugation, which is, and I quote, this is on page 2, it means untrammeled control by some person or group of people over the lives, bodies, and possessions of another person or group of people. This seems to me to be both too much and too little at the same time. It's too little in that, what's the untrammeled doing there? Right? Does it have to be untrammeled? What about trammeled control? That is limited, I take it, limited control. What's untrammeled doing there? Limiting the scope of this idea, but it's too much in that it suggests that purely private conduct that has the effect of this kind of control is at the heart of the 14th Amendment. It is not. What is at the heart of the 14th Amendment is for the state to extend less than equal protection against this sort of thing. Now, it may be that that'll help prevent untrammeled control, but that isn't the point. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, we have a cavalcade of questioners excited to go, but Evan, would you like to respond briefly first?
Well, first of all, thank you for making things that much easier for me, making my way through the evidence that I survey in this article. I was consciously following in your footsteps as I made my way through this legislative history, which I do think has a great deal of probative value and should not be discounted by originalists just because it's legislative history. The fact of the matter is that most interesting things that were said about the Equal Protection Clause that were publicly available were said after ratification. They were said in much greater detail, and they were said by people who maintained, at least the evidence that I focus on, that maintained their positions about what equal protection meant over the course of time. You can point to a couple of people who changed their positions, but they're easily identifiable. They changed their positions after Slaughterhouse, and you can accordingly discount them. With regard to your criticism, clustering around the idea that the protection has to be equal, it's the equal protection of the laws, I don't think that that jibes well with the history of the concept of protection, which was never about just equality, but ensuring that all people had a baseline level of protection from violence by the states. I mean, you can trace this back to the Blackstonian idea of security. The basic idea, the general concept is that of protection. The specific case is equal protection. But if you make your way through this history and you try to identify the particular group that was said to be unequally protected at any given time, there are certain instances in which you can say, yes, they're very obviously talking about the denial of protection to formerly enslaved people, or they're talking about the denial of protection to white Republicans. But in my view, the unifying concept behind all of this is the idea that the government has a baseline duty, and that duty, that notion of that basic duty, can be traced over the course of time. With respect to DeShaney, without getting into the specific facts of DeShaney, Rehnquist does say a couple of times very definitively that the 14th Amendment just does not apply to state action. Or state inaction. It just applies to state action. And he does say that it doesn't guarantee protection from the government. It's true that DeShaney is a due process case, and there's a footnote in DeShaney that says nobody brought an equal protection arguments, but that footnote itself refers to what I take to be one of the positions that I'm attacking in this paper, the idea that you need to affirmatively show a form of discrimination before you have an equal protection problem, first of all. And second of all, DeShaney has been interpreted by lower courts as not just being a due process opinion. It's taken to be a statement about the 14th Amendment more generally. So in going after DeShaney, I'm using it to focus attention on these two doctrines. I agree with that the facts of DeShaney make this a little bit difficult, although I still maintain that the neglect was systematic enough that I think it does raise an equal protection problem. But there are a lot of other things that you said that I disagree with, but I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about things.